So, hi everyone. Welcome to Community Tuesdays. Wonderful to see you, and you're in for a treat today. So, about a year ago, we had Dr. Schoen here to talk about the ShotSpotter technology and how it's being used in cities and now even in high schools and shopping malls. So, he told me he was working on a project to adapt the technology to saving wildlife, and I thought such a great idea to have him back. It turns out he is in Malaysia. So Gary Lauder has offered to come in his place and tell us about what they're doing, and we have his whole team here. So welcome to everyone, and thank you for coming.
Thank you, Michelle. It's quite an honor. As she mentioned, I am a stand-in for Bob Schoen, who is the founder and chief scientific officer of ShotSpotter. I'll explain why I'm the one in a moment. So first, the agenda. I'd like to do a quick audience survey. Who here has a technology background? Okay, a couple of you. And how many here are familiar with the problem of poaching of wildlife? Okay, this is not going to be a cooking class about poaching eggs. And how about the problem of blast fishing? Okay, so a couple of you are already familiar with it. Great. And how many of you have heard of ShotSpotter before? Oh, great, a number of you. And how many of you attended Dr. Schoen's speech here before? Okay, great, great. So, and they, by the way, they're on this computer, but they're facing me, which makes no sense. I'm going to turn around so they can see you. The reason why I'm the one here instead of them is that it turned out that there is a blast fishing conference in Malaysia, which is where a lot of the problem is happening. And so that was more important for them to be there than here. I'll explain more about me in a moment, and then about what is ShotSpotter, the nature of the poaching problem, how our technology is used against poaching, the problem of blast fishing, how we apply our technology against that, and Q&A, and then if time allows, I can also go into ShotSpotter history and potential futures. Firstly, why me? As I mentioned, Dr. Schoen was supposed to give this talk, and by the way, his lovely wife is here. Why don't you wave, Roberta? So I'm a venture capitalist, and I was the first investor in ShotSpotter, and I was the only investor for the first few years. And I've also been pushing the company to apply its technology for conservation purposes. I also came up with the idea of applying it to blast fishing, although right after I did, I discovered that although I thought of it, I didn't think of it first. And more than a decade prior, there were other folks in Asia who had done an experiment proving that this was an effective technique for doing so. In fact, long prior to what they did, there was a submarine that was located in the 1960s that was located based on some hydrophones 2,000 miles away detecting a faint explosion and then triangulating from that as to where the submarine sank. So the concept was not that new, but it's one thing to have something be theoretically possible. It's another thing to actually implement it. And so the folks in Asia who proved the possibility, we connected with them, since they wanted to do it, but it wasn't done. And since we have a system that is commercially deployed for detecting gunfire in cities, we have a lot of the infrastructure and technology in place that could be useful to apply for underwater blast fishing and also to catching poachers in the wild. So, and I also have been cheerleading this effort and partially funding it. And but first, I will address the what is ShotSpotter, since not everyone was here for Bob's talk. So this is a city, and in the center of those concentric rings, you have a shooter shooting a gun, and then the sound travels outwards at a known speed from there. And the gunfire, let's see, this is supposed to play gunfire, but it's not. Anyway, okay. Sound travels at 1,125 feet per second. At that speed, sound travels 1 mile in 4.2 sounds. And as many of you know, when you see lightning flash, you start counting, and based on approximately the number of seconds that you hear it, it's about 1 second for every 1,000 feet and about 5 seconds for a mile, and you can estimate how far away the lightning is. Well, it's the way that these sensors work is they're microphones distributed throughout the city. And you can imagine if there were 2 microphones and the sound arrived at both of them at the same time, then we could infer that the sound originated at a point equidistant from the two. And so basically you can imagine two dots, and then you draw a vertical line between them, and you know that the sound originated somewhere on that line. If, on the other hand, it arrives before that, then the line that you draw between them is called a hyperbola. And so you know that the sound, if, for example, it arrives 1 second sooner at one than the other, then you know it's about 1,000 feet closer to one than the other. So there's about a 500-foot differential. Then you can draw a hyperbola that points along at our 500 feet closer to one than the other. And then if you have multiple sensors, then you have multiple hyperbolae. So with 3 sensors, you have 3 hyperbolae, and where they intersect is the likely location of the shooter. And then if you have 4 sensors, there are 6 hyperbolae. And for the technically oriented here, the number of hyperbolae is n times n minus 1 over 2. So anyway, it's just the number of potential connections between them. And this is what it looks like in real life. Those are actual sensor locations and the hyperbolae, and you can see how they all intersect at this spot that where the gunshot's located. So this is a screenshot of the early version of our system showing various dots on the map where we've located gunfire. This is zoomed in a little further. It may be hard to see, but there are little red dots all over that are showing where guns have been fired. And then zooming in further, we guarantee location within 85% located within 25 meters, and it's actually more accurate than that. An interesting thing is that subsequent bullets for the same incident are much more accurate with respect to each other, because the variations in obstacles and temperature and humidity, temperature and humidity affects the speed of sound. And so on the path from a given incident, all those things don't change. And since they are consistent with each other, therefore the accuracy of locations within a given shooting are very accurate. And so, for example, it's accurate enough to measure the speed of a car in a drive-by shooting. And it's even to detect that there were shots coming out of both sides of the car. As you can see in this picture, we were able to determine not only that the car was going 45 miles per hour, but that there was people shooting out of both windows. So what a sensor sees looks like this. This is time on the horizontal axis and amplitude on the vertical. And this is from a forensic report. A forensic analysis have determined that there were 2 shooters in a shootout. The upper one is the A shooter, the lower one is the B shooter. And part of this was determined based on it locating these 2 shooters in 2 different spots. In this scenario, the B shooter was a policeman, and police are trained to go, to bam, 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 and then stop. And this ended in an unfortunate way for the non-policeman. So for wildlife poaching with guns is obviously a serious problem, and it comes in many forms. It's done for food, also known as bushmeat, especially gorillas, which is really sad, and for horns and tusks of elephants and rhinoceri. A rhino horn value today is on the order of $100,000 per kilogram, due to the snake oil beliefs in China and Vietnam that rhino horn confers some kind of medical benefits. Rhino horn is, like most horns, made of keratin, the same substance that's in our hair and fingernails. But due to these crazy beliefs, tiny amounts sell for large amounts of money, and as a result, there's species that are being driven to extinction because of these beliefs. The rhino poaching rate is projected to cause extinction in the wild in about a decade. And this is, unfortunately, what a rhino poaching scene looks like. This graph is not so easy to read the numbers, but let me read them for you. Firstly, the red graph is the rhino population, and this is in Africa. And the blue graph is the number of rhinos poached per year. And on the vertical axis, the top of the axis is 25,000, and so this starts at around 20,000 rhinos. It ends at 0, and it goes to 0 according to this projection by 2025. And this assumes that nothing else happens to make this stop. And one of the unfortunate trends is that as the more we succeed at stopping rhino poaching, the more scarce rhino horns become, the higher the value in the black market. And so this is a tough battle to eradicate. So ShotSpotter did a trial in South Africa's Kruger National Park, and we deployed in May of 2015 in 1 square mile, which is about 2.5 square kilometers, which was merely 0.0125% of the area of the Kruger National Park. And 11 months later, it was activated by gunshots. 4 poachers were caught and convicted. And it was an interesting story. So it took 44 minutes to verify that it was a gunshot and to get the team to the spot. It happened at night, and the people driving their vehicles couldn't go at full speed to get there because they were at risk of crashing into an elephant or a rhino on the road there. And these distances are vast. So it took 44 minutes from the time of the gunshot till they actually got on the spot. And the poachers are usually never detected. So they were just hanging out, having a cigarette, waiting for the rhinoceros to die, and leisurely cutting off the horn. When they heard the vehicles approaching with the dogs, they then ran for their lives. A chase ensued, and the poachers dropped a lot of clothing and shoes to distract the dogs, throw them off the scent. And in the clothing of 2 of the poachers were the IDs, since it turned out those were park rangers who were meant to protect the animals. With those IDs, those poachers were caught, and then they identified the other 2. They were all convicted. But despite this success, we've actually not been able to get additional deployments. Not quite sure why. One version I've heard is that they're more interested in buying the traditional paramilitary equipment of helicopters. But one of the key reasons is that as a company, we're really focused on the urban gunfire issue, and that these other things we only have some people working part-time, and we don't have the resources to fully pursue this. Although one of our partners overseas, who I believe is on the call, Ian, who we'll hear from later, does do this part-time for him, since he also has various aspects of his business, getting refrigerated vaccines into the right places in Africa and various other businesses. But anyway, it's a great opportunity, but not adequately resourced. So we're looking for individuals to hire for this and funding for it as well. So let me talk a little bit about blast fishing, which is also called dynamite fishing or fish bombing. Earlier I showed a video relating to that while we were testing the AV. I thought rather than see nothing, you might as well see a preview of that. So when an explosive is detonated underwater, the shock waves stun or kill fish. Most of the fish sink, but the ones that float get scooped up. And it's destroying reefs all over the Indo-Pacific and the east coast of Africa. This map shows the major reefs that are at risk, although these are at risk for a lot of reasons, including bleaching and other things, not just fish bombing. An area of particular concern is called the Coral Triangle, and this is a map of it. It's a triangle that runs from Japan at the top, across Indonesia, out to the Solomon Islands, and it encompasses parts of Malaysia, and actually all of Malaysia, and Papua New Guinea, and also a little newly independent company called Eastern Timor, Timor-Leste, the president of which is also very involved with this. It only covers 1.6% of the planet's ocean area, but it has 76% of all known coral species in the world. That's why it's called the Coral Triangle, and that's where the world's best scuba diving is. But unfortunately, there are a lot of poor people there who are doing this to feed their families. The blasts detonate above reefs, and it's very destructive to nearly all sea life. This shows you what it looks like. Let's see if the audio works. Yep. This was actually our people doing it in a place where there were no reefs around. We were doing this test to see how far away we could detect it. And what we found is that we ran out of cellular signal before we ran out of acoustic signal. So we know that it's detectable at least 20 kilometers away, which is a very useful thing because the cost of any sensor network is a function of the sensor density. And since sound travels so much further underwater than we can have our sensors spread out, and therefore it shouldn't cost too much. There's a video that I would like to show you, which is not the one I began before.
I was lucky enough to arrive in Sabah 20 years ago. It was a fabulous experience. We saw marine turtles, we saw whale sharks, there was fish of all different colors and stripes and shapes and sizes. So there we were on day 3, and then all of a sudden there was this huge sound. It turned out someone had dropped a bomb.
So I came to Sabah 20 years ago. I started Scuba Zoo, and since then we've been documenting the gradual degradation of the reefs from destructive fishing techniques, overfishing and fish bombing, and it's been absolutely terrible to see.
Fish bombing has been a problem for us for a long time, and we are not able to locate the fish bombing immediately, and we don't have the exact location.
The problem really occurs when you come to the next day and you have to try and get more fish. That patch that has been bombed will never produce more fish.
The coral reef is of utmost importance to Sabah, not only because it's important to the sea, but it's important to the tourism industry. And last year, diving industry got us 384 million ringgit, which is a big sum of money. And all that will be gone if the coral reef is gone.
Annually, the Department of Fisheries detect about 60 to 80 cases of either fish bombing or fishermen caught in the possession of fish caught by explosive. Once we catch the suspect, there is the added problem of proving in court that they are guilty.
This almost daily experience of being bombed in the water got me thinking, and my background is in physics. Could we use detection systems based on physical principles to detect and locate where individual bomb events were going off? Was that going to be possible? And I thought it was.
2 years ago, the chairman of the board of ShotSpotter told me he really wants to help solve the fish bombing problem. So he sent me the 2 papers that George Woodman of Ting Hoi had written. Then we contacted him and described how our system worked, and it's a marriage of his stuff and our stuff.
I spent a lot of years on NASA programs, and I've been very excited to join ShotSpotter to fight an important problem, which is gun violence in America. 20 years, hundreds of millions of dollars, to take an idea and develop it into an operational system that can track gunfire in real time to a level of quality that can be used in evidence in a court of law. The system has been deployed in many cities. The criminals know it is there. Gunshot incidents has reduced and has become an effective deterrent and a name to be feared. But also here they are interested in fighting fish bombing for purposes of saving our reefs.
With the new technology, we see this as a potential. This could be the answer after many, many years.
Well, we know the technology works for detecting gunshots in San Francisco. Now comes the real test. Will it work underwater in Sabah? Man. We got it again, Bob, within 10 seconds.
Okay, yes, I see incidents on all 4 of our fixed sensors.
Here's the sound arriving in 4 sensors that did the triangulation. The blast happened seconds ago, and to my knowledge, this is the first time that we've calibrated the location of an underwater explosion with GPS. We have a real system that works. It will be reliable. Locates the bombs really well, and we can catch them.
I'm very impressed with the technology. Obviously, a bomb goes off, and then 4 seconds later, it's up in the internet, in front of our computers. We can make a decision straight away. Wait, we'll send our enforcement people. So I'm very impressed. This is what we are hopeful we can implement one day.
Fish bombing is a worldwide problem. And the groundbreaking trials we've just done here in Sabah are absolutely vital. But it's not just about stopping fish bombing, it's about finding sustainable alternatives for the stakeholders. They're just trying to feed their kids.
Now that we have the equipment, we need to take it to the next level. And this is where funding is absolutely necessary. And we hope that we will be able to get the fund so that eventually we will be able to solve the fish bombing problems, not only in Sabah, but in other parts of the world. This is our legacy to the next generations, keeping the coral reef healthy.
So blasts make very little noise above the water. That creates the challenge of detection. It's very hard to know when fish blasting is occurring. After the fact, you find the destruction, but in real time, it's really hard to detect. And when people are scuba diving within miles of it, you can hear the blasts, but it's really hard to know where they're happening. And one way that they've attempted to stop blast fishing is to go into the markets and look for fish whose swim bladders have been destroyed by the shock. That's how, it's the main mechanism by which it kills the fish is by bursting their swim bladders. And when people get caught that way, then they stop selling those fish in the market and instead eat it themselves, trade it with other families they trust. And so it's really, really hard to catch. And so this is probably the only way to detect this kind of thing. As I mentioned, sound travels 10 to 100 times farther underwater, so the sensor density needed is that squared, a function of that squared. So that's either 1/100th as many or to 1/10,000th as many compared to air. So it's a much more sparse network, and with only 6 sensors, we can cover hundreds of square miles since we can detect from over 20 kilometers away. Once we detect that a blast has occurred, you can send a drone out that could either identify the boat and potentially the crew on the boat, and or can track the boat via radar and then confiscate the boat and its fish when it returns, or send out an enforcement vessel. So doing those things would probably put a stop to it. Since people are relying on this, you can also expect that many of these people would try to vandalize them. And so we have to design the sensors to be able to hide themselves and also continuously report in on their status in case someone has vandalized any of them. So what's unenforceable today can soon be enforced with this, but ultimately enforcement is not enough, as the president of East Timor pointed out. We must teach people sustainable fishing techniques or other means of gaining a livelihood, because people are doing this to feed themselves, and it's hard for anyone to concern themselves with preserving a species or an ecosystem if their own family is facing starvation. So some of the next steps. When last year I met with a minister in Malaysia who told me that they want this yesterday. So there are a number of governments and NGOs who are identifying the problem, but again, similar to the poaching, we're looking for someone to manage this effort as well as the resources to pursue it. And we're starting to talk with some NGOs and 501c3s, and we'll probably establish a partnership that would enable one to donate to that entity, for example, Conservation International or Environmental Defense Fund, that would be restricted towards the goal of funding this effort. So that is the end of my presentation. Sorry, you wait till it comes out on video. Actually, I am recording this for that purpose. I thank you, and first we have Q&A, and then if we have time after that, I can go into some other stuff you might find interesting regarding ShotSpotter history. So for now, are there any questions? I'll be happy to repeat them. Yes, in the back. Michelle asked, is the punishment for the poachers enough to stop them? And same question for the elephants. I don't know is the answer. There are some places in Africa where the standing order is to shoot poachers on sight and not to capture and try them. They are at risk of their life and they know it, and as a result, there have been a number of situations where the poachers are shooting at the people who are trying to shoot at them or capture them. So it is a mortal issue. Given the value of what's at stake and the fact that these people are armed anyway, it's not really clear what will dissuade them. However, making it harder, making it more risky, having a lot more poachers disappear and either into jail or otherwise, obviously helps reduce it. There are a number of efforts to try to get countries like China and Vietnam to ban ivory and rhino horn. I believe that China has agreed to ban ivory. Whether how far that goes remains to be seen, and whether private markets will continue remains to be seen. They've tried to get China to ban shark fin soup, and they haven't succeeded so well with that. There are also a number of other efforts to try to rein in poaching by way of flying drones, setting up motion detectors with cameras and radio transmitters. So there are it's a multifaceted effort. I don't think any one technology is the absolute solution. By the way, an interesting issue with respect to using our system to detect poaching. Elephants, it turns out, snap a lot of limbs off of trees, and that snapping sound sounds a lot like gunfire. There are thousands of such sounds for every one real gunfire, and so our system has to filter out to know the difference. In a similar way, under the ocean, there are certain types of shrimp that make incredibly loud snapping noises. There's a mantis shrimp whose claw is able to hit a shell, a crustacean, at a speed that is so fast that it creates cavitation, which for physicists in the room would astound you. And it's very loud, but very localized. But if there happens to be a sensor here, and shrimp here, and shrimp here, they could fool our sensors into thinking that it's really a central thing. So the filtration of these potentially false positives is one of the technological challenges, and which makes it a fascinating multidimensional problem. But as far as deterring poachers, it's not clear. I mean, as I said, there's no one solution. It has to be multifaceted, and it's not enough to simply try to kill them or incarcerate them, because if the economic opportunity is too great or perceived as too great, there'll always be more poachers to replace it. It's also worth mentioning that both of these types of trades there are linkages between the trade in these illegal tusks and rhino horns and terrorism financing. There are lots of connections. Also, for example, with blast fishing, the explosives that are used for blast fishing have also been used for other terroristic activities. And so there are lots of crossover between the two. I can't get into all the details, but this is a vicious cycle that needs to be interdicted. I mean, just as an example, there's a lot of blast fishing that occurs in the southern Philippines, where there's an Islamic terrorist group that has been problematic and kidnapping people and so forth. So anyway, questions? So the question was, have rhinos in zoos been attacked for their horns? And the answer is, I don't know. I am unaware of that having happened, but I don't know if it has. It's a reasonable hypothesis that it could, because they're not adequately guarded at night. It's also the case that if they are extinct in the wild, it's conceivable that they could be kept in, these species could be kept in captivity, but I don't know how successful they've been in mating in zoos, so I can't really address that. Yes?
So I imagine if in 2025 we use them, I think it's going to be a permanent loss.
Okay, so this informed member of the audience said that they have a very hard time getting rhinos to reproduce in captivity. So if they do become extinct in the wild, they will probably go extinct. It's also worth mentioning that. Actually, I won't go on that tangent since there are other questions. Did you have a separate question? Yes.
Can the system work unattended? Or does someone have to be sitting at it while it's functioning?
The question is, can the system run unattended, or does someone have to be sitting at it while it's functioning? The answer is that today, all of our systems do have a human in the loop. And we have what we call an Incident Review Center, ICR, which is staffed 24/7 by one or more people, depending on the load. And those people listen to so there's first a level of filtration that happens in the system. So the system has to believe it sounds like gunfire. If the system sounds like gunfire, then it sends it to our Incident Review Center, where a human determines whether it really is. And the reason for that is we found that we needed humans to 100% eliminate false positives, meaning, what crying wolf, because when police were being dispatched to and it turns out to be a firecracker or whatever, then they stop believing it. And if they stop believing it, then when the real thing happens, then they don't go. So by eliminating false positives, we have dramatically improved not only customer satisfaction, but also the response time of the police, because now when they get an alert, they know it's real. So in the poaching or blast fishing scenarios, I don't know whether the system could automatically make that determination without a human. It might, and we are investing in improving our artificial intelligence, machine learning capabilities to automate and improve on the recognition of those sounds, but it's not yet human-free. I would expect someday it will be, but we're not there yet. Mm-hmm. The question is, what is the belief what are the beliefs for what rhino horn can do for one medicinally? I believe it is supposed to improve potency, relieve impotence, improve male potency. There are known things that are better for that. Yeah, exactly. So they obviously don't get enough spam. There are other things, and I don't know what they are. But I'm thinking that what I'm hoping somebody will do is come up with fake rhino horn that they couldn't tell apart. That would be great, because if they flood the market with that, then prices could go down. But who knows? Yeah. Let me repeat the question. Some park rangers have removed the horns of rhinoceri to make them less likely to be preyed upon for their horn, which certainly makes a lot of sense. I have heard that it causes the females not to want to mate with such males. However, I don't know if that's how correct that is, but that obviously if that could work, that would be a potential opportunity. And I don't really know if it does or doesn't work. I know it's also the case that if the horn is amputated without proper medical care, then the rhino will bleed to death. This raises the question, if poachers use tranquilizer darts and then remove the horn such that it could come to afterwards, unless they cauterize it properly, that won't work. And then I don't know about reproduction, as I mentioned. Yeah. Uh-huh. Oh, yes, right, of course. So we have dialed in via Skype Dr. Bob Showen, who's up at like 4 a.m. from Malaysia, and Clark Dunson, a partner, and Ian Lester, who is connected from South Africa. So we're going to switch inputs to get them on the screen.
If I may, I don't know if you guys can hear me clearly. Just to perhaps expand on some of the questions which I heard asked, but I don't think you could hear us. We were trying to sort of, reply, I guess. One of the questions that was asked is, what are the perceived or believed uses of rhino horn? And one of them you touched on, of course, is male potency, but actually that is one of the smaller uses or in terms of the demand for rhino horn. And in reality, the real driver in terms of demand for rhino horn at the moment is, in fact, it's believed to be a cure for cancer. And the story as to how this occurred sort of goes back a couple of years, where a Vietnamese general was diagnosed with cancer and visited a traditional healer in Vietnam, who then essentially prescribed rhino horn, and subsequently he went into remission. And he then went public with this fact that in his mind the rhino horn had helped him cure his cancer. And of course, that then created this explosive demand for rhino horn, specifically in Vietnam, which now consumes probably about 90% of the product. So, a lot of the original thought was that it's a cure for impotency, also hangovers, but the real thing is a cure for cancer. And of course, it has absolutely no medicinal benefit whatsoever. It's as good as chewing your fingernails in terms of of what it is. But that's the real driver behind why people want rhino horn. The other thing which was asked right at the beginning is, are the punishments for poaching not adequate to create some sort of a deterrent? And I think the answer to that one is any punishment is only as effective as your ability to apprehend the suspect. And that is truly where I think ShotSpotter is a game changer, in the sense that right now, and I'll give you some of the stats, in the Kruger National Park, in any one given day, there are approximately 15 poaching teams active in the Kruger. For every 15 rhino carcasses that these teams will create by poaching the animal, the anti-poaching forces will only make contact once with a poaching team. So at a statistical level, a poacher essentially has a 93% probability of success, which in any business model is a very good business model. And therefore, the punishments, as severe as they may be, and in my opinion, they're not severe enough, but the reality is that poachers don't fear the punishment because they know that 93% of the time, they're probably not going to get caught. Where ShotSpotter comes in is that, and we believe, and certainly the guys we've worked with in the Kruger believe, that you'll probably get that to at least a 50-50, where the poacher's chances of being either caught and arrested or shot will be the flip of a coin. And that we believe is the game changer in terms of creating the deterrent that will change the minds of not the professionals, because there are certain people, these are professional organized criminal syndicates who are moving rhino horn. But what it will do is take out the amateurs who will rather not do it for that reason. And what is also interesting is, in the same way that urban gunfire, what we do know is that a very small percentage of the shooters are doing the majority of the damage. And even in the Kruger's case, there are very effective poaching teams, and then there are less effective poaching teams. So we know if we take out the effective poaching teams, we probably deal with the majority of the problem by taking them out of circulation. So maybe that answers some of the questions.
Thank you, Ian. Could you also identify yourself, since I didn't give you a proper introduction? That's Ian Lester, connecting from South Africa. Ian, can you hear me?
This is Bob in Malaysia. Ian, we heard your talk. I'm not sure that the main venue heard your talk.
Yes, they did.
I'm almost convinced they didn't
hear us.
No, we did hear it. Hello? We heard you loud and clear. Thank you. Anyway, okay, so it's a little challenging to communicate to all parts of the world at the moment. The sun has not setting on the ShotSpotter team. So in the meantime, can I address additional questions? Yes.
Can you run through the phenomena that has been reported, and the fact that the elephants that are now being born, many of them are being born without tusks, they sort of from their genetic pool for ivory, and that the subsequent elephants that are being born now have small tusks or none at all?
I didn't know that. Oh, yes, sorry. So he was pointing out that they have managed to breed or modify the DNA of some elephants to be born with no tusks or small tusks. I don't know how that works out for mating and so forth, but that's a hopeful thing. That's great. Yes?
Is there any fish bombing occurring around the perimeter of the United States?
The question is there any fish bombing occurring around the perimeter of the United States, including Hawaii? Having done some research on YouTube, I can tell you that fish bombing does happen in American lakes and rivers. However, I don't think that there aren't any reefs, and therefore there's no reef destruction. It does kill lots of fish unnecessarily. As I mentioned, when fish bombing occurs, most of the fish sink, and typically when people do it, they only scoop up the ones up above. Some of the fish bombing I've seen in America is throwing an explosive in the water, not as high a power as what I showed you, and then that causes the fish all around to start jumping. And in all the videos, you see lots of people laughing, ha ha ha, and then some of the fish jump into the boat, some of the fish jump into nets. So in that scenario, I suspect but don't know that many of the fish are startled but not hurt. I'm not saying it's okay, but I mean, but I think one would call that fish blasting. However, it's not as consequential, in my opinion, as what occurs in Asia. However, I'm out of my league in making that conjecture, but just judging based on what I've seen and what little I know. So, Susan. Right. Hold on. Since your comment may be too long for me to repeat.
Just that a rhino without its horns or an elephant without its tusks, and the folks and closer to this may be able to answer this, but my sense was that those were their main forms of protection in the wild. And so once you're removing their horn or their tusks, you've really limited their ability to survive. So they can comment on that. But my question earlier was about the use of ShotSpotter in Chicago. I recently saw something on a documentary about ShotSpotter being used in Chicago, and we've all heard about how much crime they've had, especially fatalities from gun violence, and how it's being combined with other technologies. And I thought maybe you could just, if you haven't already, could comment on that, because it's such an important use of your technology.
Sure. Okay, I will call on you next, I promise. By the way, let me just see if they can hear us. Can you hear us yet? And folks on the phone? Can you hear me?
Are you speaking to?
Yes,
Are you speaking to Malaysia? We hear this last question.
Oh, good.
If we can be heard.
So, Ian, if
we can hear you.
Ian, if you could address the question of whether the horns are useful to rhinos in protecting themselves from predators.
Well, rhinos actually have no predators. I mean, it'll be a very brave lion to try and take down a 3-ton rhino. So it just doesn't happen. So rhinos actually have no natural predators other than man, I guess. Yeah, and so the answer is no. They don't need the horn, other than obviously during mating season. The bulls will essentially joust for mating rights, and their horn is used for that. Yeah, but absolutely no effect on the rhino whatsoever. But it is an important point, because a lot of people sort of think, well, why don't we just dehorn these animals? A rhino horn grows like a fingernail does, and it continually grows, and it will replace itself usually every 4 years. Now, there's a couple of problems with the dehorning process. Number one, it's extremely expensive to do. To dehorn a rhino, you need a helicopter with a vet with the right tranquilizers. You need a ground team of 3 or 4 vehicles with 15, sometimes 20 people to take down one rhino. While you dart him, you put him at extreme risk for the simple reason is that the M99 tranquilizer is a very, very dangerous thing to use, and you could stress the animal to the point where he dies during the process. So darting and dehorning rhino is really the last resort. And even if you do it, the reality is that it has very little effect on the outcome, for the simple reason is that a poacher who spends 3 or 4 days tracking a rhino, when he finds it, typically at night, chances are he's not going to see whether or not that rhino has a horn or not. At the same time, the reality is if you just imagine a rhino horn, which is a very long conical shape that can get to almost 1 meter long, the vast majority of the weight of the horn, and remember that rhino horn is sold in grams, much like cocaine would be sold. The vast majority of the weight of the horn sits in the base of the horn. When you dehorn, you typically take the top part of the horn, but 2/3 of the weight remains on the animal. So it is highly unlikely that a poacher who's just spent 3 days trying to find this animal, upon finding it, to see that it now has a third of the weight less on its head, would refrain from shooting it because it's less of a horn. He's still going to shoot it. And in fact, what we're even finding is that often when there is a mother rhino and she has a young calf, the poacher, who is a pure opportunist, will shoot the mother. He'll dehorn her, and then he will shoot the baby and take a 100-gram horn off of an 8-month-old calf. So when a product is worth $100,000 a kilogram, every gram counts. And taking the horn does not remove the entire horn, because as Gary rightly pointed out, doing that would kill the animal. So there is enough horn left on the animal to make it extremely valuable. So dehorning is an absolute last resort. It's extremely expensive and, in my opinion, completely ineffective in solving the problem. The only way to solve the problem is to catch the well, there's two parts. Number one is to reduce the demand in the Far East, which is to change the minds and the hearts and the culture of people in Vietnam. Now, that is an exercise which would take decades to achieve. So we don't have the luxury of that time. While people are trying to work on that, we have to try and keep the species alive by catching the bad guy. And that's really what we're trying to do down here with the ShotSpotter technology.
Thank you, Ian. Can you hear me now? If so, can you introduce yourself? Just to explain who you are and what you do.
Sure. Okay. So I have a business here in South Africa that is sort of an IoT or Internet of Things solution provider, and we've become particularly good at doing, sort of solving tough problems in hard places. So my day job, if you want to call it that, is we use our IoT platform to remotely monitor vaccine fridges in the developing world. We're currently in 54 countries to make sure that vaccines stay at the right temperature so they can prevent disease. So that's my day job. We contacted the team at ShotSpotter. It was about 4.5 years ago. We made contact with Ralph Clark, and we've been working with Ralph and Gary and his team here in South Africa, where not only have we deployed it up in the Kruger National Park, as Gary rightly pointed out, but we've also deployed it in its more traditional context, which is in the Cape Town, in an area known as the Cape Flats, where we obviously look to capture gunfire related to gang activity. And I think I couldn't quite hear at the beginning, but what we found when we deployed the technology up in the Kruger is, given the reality of the bush, an extremely quiet place with no physical or hard objects that can obstruct or refract sound, we got far better performance in terms of lower sensor density and further distance in detecting gunfire. And of course, when you think of rhino poaching, you don't shoot a rhino with a 9mm pistol because he will, quite frankly, you'll just make him mad and he'll kill you. So you're talking very heavy caliber weapons. So with that, you're able to detect gunfire at far longer ranges. And by the way, we also tested, and I don't know if Gary mentioned this, as I said, I couldn't hear, but we also tested both suppressed and unsuppressed weapons, or in layman's terms, silence weapons. And it made absolutely no difference in terms of the effectiveness of the system, quite simply because the calibers that are being used are so heavy that it has zero impact on the system's ability to detect and locate that shot.
Thanks, Ian. So just to elaborate on that a bit, so silencers that you see in movies are not nearly as silenced as they show in movies. So it can reduce the loudness around 30 dB, but that's still pretty loud. And it turns out that our system in our existing deployments is still sensitive enough to pick it up most of the time. So there was a question. Oh, wait, before I get to your question, Susan asked 2 questions. The other was about Chicago. And by the way, timing-wise, I have 2:11 on the clock, and this is supposed to go to 2:30. So we will have time for lots more questions, although if anyone has to leave, I won't be insulted. So Chicago did finally deploy our technology within the past year, and there have been some articles about 2 precincts that it's located in, how it has had a substantially positive effect on lowering gunfire and homicide rates. And it turned also part of what was written about those precincts is that the precinct captains are for those 2 precincts are known as the Johnson twins, who are identical twins. And so it's a very colorful, interesting interview. But anyway, so yes, it's having a very substantial impact there. And I wish it had happened sooner, but the best time for things to happen is, before. The next best time is now. So it's happening. So, yes, your question.
Is there a worldwide effort to unify resources, raise enough money to combat perpetrators, protect the species? And also, is there evidence that nations on a large scale are interested in the wildlife we're talking about today?
Yes, so the question was, is there a worldwide effort to combat the problems that I described, and is there enough effort to try to bring them back? I would say that there are lots of countries that are very interested in stopping the problem, and then but those are mostly countries that are not involved in the problem. So the country that is neither the country in which the poaching occurs nor in which the sale of the contraband occurs. There are lots of third parties who say that that should stop. Providing money to help make that stop can help, but what's most needed is the countries in which the poaching or blast fishing occurs, that they make an effort, and the countries in which these products are sold, it's critical to cut off the demand. There's progress, but not enough. So, are there any other questions? Michelle. So Michelle pointed out this seems like it would be good application for drone technology, and the answer is yes, very much so. So our conception is that upon detection, drones would launch, fly to the spot, and identify and photograph the poachers, ideally from a sufficient distance that they don't know they're being photographed, because remember, they have guns, and it's like skeet shooting to shoot down a drone. So I believe that would be a very effective use. Also, drones are being used proactively. They're starting to be used proactively to just fly in a pattern with thermal infrared cameras at night to try to identify warm human bodies that are where they shouldn't belong. And within, for example, the Kruger National Park, at night, there's not supposed to be anyone unauthorized out there using a cell phone. And so if the system picks up a cell phone out there, then that, I think, does trigger some kind of alert. So the poachers have learned, don't carry a cell phone, or if they do, don't leave it on. So that's not an effective detection method at present. But anyway, but drones are very, very promising for all sorts of issues like this. By the way, if we run out of questions, I have some additional background on the history of ShotSpotter, how it came to be, and some of the interesting futures, including drones and other things. If you'd like, I can reattach that. Yes, Michelle?
Palo Alto. This is
Hold on.
Bob in Malaysia. I would like to make a comment.
Go ahead, Bob.
Okay, we weren't sure we were getting through to you. I think you have, the audience probably gets a good feeling from about what we have been doing over the past 20 years. And I also want to say we will be expanding our work here in Malaysia and in the coral reefs. The governments here seem quite interested in having us. The last thing I want to say is, while I am the founder of the company, it was your speaker, Gary Lauder's interest and funding which made us into a real company, and we want to acknowledge that.
Well, thank you. Thank you all, and thank you, Bob. I appreciate the acknowledgement, but as with any team, it would never have happened without your not only coming up with this, but continuing to refine, improve, and extend your initial designs. And so it's been a great team. And also I'm proud of the fact that you and your co-founders are still all with us, because it's a rare thing to have that level of dedication for so many years. And so I really appreciate that from you and the rest of your team. Are there any other questions, or do you want me to go into some of the interesting future stuff? Question. The question is whether we get funding from governments in Africa and Malaysia, and the answer is not yet. The government of South Africa is involved in trying to stop rhino poaching, and but they get most of their funds, I believe, from various NGOs and philanthropists. But Ian Lester can speak more directly to that. Ian?
Yeah, it's one of the big frustrations we have here. Yeah, and I fully understand the problem. Yeah, for those of you who either know or have been to South Africa, not just South Africa, but Africa, is wildlife conservation. Yeah, if you sort of just think back of the history of Africa, many indigenous Africans view wildlife as a natural resource at the cultural level. And the rhino is no different. You know, they've lived off the land for generations, and wildlife are simply a means to feeding themselves and their family. And the rhino just happens to have gotten the worst end of the stick, in the sense that what happens to sit in its face is worth $600,000 each time you kill one. And when you think of that in terms of context, and then you overlay the realities of the other challenges that my country and other African countries are faced with, issues with education, healthcare, unemployment, infrastructure, it is almost political suicide at the government level to allocate any level of meaningful resources to the issue of rhino conservation when there are children who don't have food and don't have schools and don't have hospitals. So with those realities in play, it's for the government to put a rhino ahead of the human population would be extremely difficult. And that is why the vast majority of the anti-poaching efforts that do happen in Africa are funded by external and predominantly Western donors. Yeah, because the reality is, I suppose, in your and my life, we understand that a rhino is an endangered species and needs to be protected. And we understand the bigger picture in terms of how those funds are used to fund things like terrorism and organized crime. But if you are worrying about where the next meal is going to come from, those things are irrelevant. And that's what we find is quite difficult and challenging. And we appreciate that reality, but nevertheless, we need to find a way around it. So yeah, it's a very tough and awkward question, but the reality is that I don't think any African government would be bold enough to commit the kind of resources that are required to actually solve this problem. And I think the same applies for blast fishing in Malaysia. There are people who are doing blast fishing are feeding their families by doing that. And to stop them from doing that is a very big ask for any government who understands the impact of hunger.
Right. Thank you. And that addresses the necessity of having to help these people find another way to feed themselves. So are there any other questions? So, okay. Well, if not, I will then, assuming that there's some interest, I will revert to the other computer and then show you some interesting stuff. If anyone has thought of a question while I'm reconnecting things, feel free to ask it. So I thought I'd go through some of the early history of ShotSpotter, which is intrinsically interesting and in which Bob Showen features heavily. So in 1990, well, I guess I should go back even further. The notion of using audio triangulation to locate a gunshot was first tried shortly after the assassination of JFK with the Zapruder tape, and where they basically tried to take audio from different recording devices that were in that plaza to try to triangulate where the gunshots came from. But I don't think it was ever successfully done because of the lack of synchronization or whatnot. So in more recent history, About 1991, Dr. John Lauer of the U.S. Geological Survey proposed a system to Menlo Park Police using seismograph technology for a gunshot location system, and he got some small funding. And he used walkie-talkies as part of that, and it wasn't all that effective, but he wrote a paper that Bob Showen said was interesting, and Bob independently came up with the same idea, a different implementation, and Bob is an RF and acoustics expert, and he was working at SRI, Stanford Research Institute, which is within range of hearing gunshots wafting over from East Menlo Park and East Palo Alto. And so he proposed a similar system to the Menlo Park Police, who then told him about Dr. Lauer, and so they conferred. Ultimately, Bob decided to pursue this full time, so he left SRI to do so. And he founded Trilon, which stood for Triangulation on Noise. Oh, Bob, by the way, if you're hearing this and have anything to add or correct me on, please do. He sold a system to Redwood City for $25,000, and he turned it on at midnight and located the first gunfire at 2 a.m. that night. The company had about 4 deployments prior to my involvement in 2004. And my story with the company begins in the late 90s, where I was in the U.S. Geological Survey map room buying some maps, and afterwards, outside in the bulletin board, I read the story on the bulletin board about the use of seismograph technology for gunfire location, which I thought was interesting. Then, a few years later, in the year 2000, I read a New York Times Magazine article named "The Big Bad Fun Gun," which was about 50 caliber sniper rifles and how they could be used for terrorist and awful purposes. So I thought, I sure hope that terrorists don't figure that out. And then 9/11 happened, and I looked into it and found that the USA had trained the Mujahideen on the use of 50 caliber sniper rifles against the Russian invaders, and then the Mujahideen, of course, became the Taliban. So I guess that cat was already out of the bag. And and then I remembered the USGS posting on the bulletin board that I'd read, so I searched for it. I don't think I Googled it because Google wasn't really a thing then. It existed, but less so. And I found Bob's small website, called him up, set up a meeting, enjoyed meeting him. So Bob was not dead set on remaining the CEO, but nor was he willing to give me control to put any potential buffoon in, appropriately so. He didn't know me very well. And I was not so sure that he would ever approve any CEO that I wanted. And so we amicably parted ways at that time. And then a few months later, in 2003, a friend of mine named James Beldock had just sold his company. I was looking for his next challenge, and I thought, I think that James might be perfect for this. So I introduced him to Bob, and James consulted with Bob for a while, and they got to know each other well. And when ultimately Bob felt comfortable with James as the CEO, and so I invested at the same time. So that happened in 2004, and my thesis was that every city that had a gunfire problem should deploy this technology, since the societal cost of gunfire vastly exceeds the cost of our system, which I'm sure is correct. I was the sole investor for several years, despite trying to raise funds, and eventually Pascal Levinson, the Levinson Capital Partners, and others joined. And so James achieved some great things and was with us for a decade until he sought newer pastures and is now at internet.org, which is part of Facebook, bringing the internet to the last billion people on Earth. Ralph Clark, the current CEO, joined us a little over 6 years ago, and he pioneered the current business model of selling the gunshot location system as a service. Before, it was a systems sale. So every year, we had to sell new systems, and it was very variable based on all sorts of things. And the financial crisis of 2008 and 9 was substantially set us back, and it was one of the things that triggered our realizing that recurring revenue would be a much better model. So part of our problem was that we trained our customers, the police, the dispatchers, we trained them as to how to differentiate gunshots from not gunshots, but they had a lot of turnover, and so that expertise was lost, and so they were basically sending out all the alerts to the police, which had a lot of false positives, crying wolf, so the police didn't respond, and no one was very happy with it. So Ralph pioneered for us this platform as a service, which is kind of like software as a service, but it's more than just software, and paid for us to have trained humans reviewing the incidents in our incident review center, as I mentioned, 24/7, and that also solved the business model problem of having tremendous revenue fluctuations. So now we have very consistent and predictable revenues, which is much easier to finance. So the company has expanded and now is in, I think, around over 80 cities. I don't remember the last count, and has saved, depending on how you count, has saved somewhere between hundreds and thousands of lives. I mean, it's you know, you can. It's hard to say we saved that life, but when homicide rates go down and when gunfire rates go down, you're saving lives. Just don't know which ones. We do occasionally save the life of a specific person who was on the sidewalk dying and would have died but for the police showing up quickly. But that's more the exception than the rule. So I also mentioned that there are some potential futures that are interesting. Some of the potential future applications that excite me, but are not sufficiently material to make it into the company's formal plans and selling materials are, for example, in shell casing forensics. So today, the best practices are that when the police show up, and usually the shooter is gone and there isn't a body or an injured person, but sometimes there are witnesses, which can be very useful, but always there are shell casings. Few people use revolvers. Almost everybody uses a semi-automatic handgun, which eject the shells. And guns cause consistent scratches on those shell casings. So the ATF has a system called NIBIN, which stands for National Integrated Ballistics Information Network, which correlates the scratches on shells back to specific weapons. And while identifying a weapon doesn't necessarily tell you which person has it, it does help you link different crimes. And so, for example, sometimes you have shell casings and a witness who says who owns the gun. So, and then other times you have a body and you have shell casings and no witnesses. So, but the shell casings can tell you that that gun in the other case was fired by a certain individual, and then you know who to pursue. So it's only a subset of our existing customers are using that, but that holds huge potential. I met about a year or two ago with the head of the crime lab in Washington, D.C. that is able to lift DNA off of spent shell casings. This is from the person loading the cartridge. And also there is now the ability being developed to lift fingerprints from the shell casings. So that those forensics, I think, hold a lot of promise, especially when you combine all three together. So then another interesting opportunity, I conceived and we as a company patented the ability to use gunshot location service to trigger a query of the cellular phone system to answer the question, who is at that gunfire incident? So it can tell you about potential witnesses or potential suspects. And since it is the case that very few shooters represent the vast majority of gunfire, if you see that shooting here, shooting here, shooting here, and the same individuals keep popping up at every shooting, then it gives you a sense of whose hand you might want to swab for gunpowder residue. So this has not yet been implemented anywhere, and to do so would require a search warrant. So, but this is I'm still looking for forward-thinking agencies that want to pursue that, and it raises a survivability question. But ultimately, the real question is: are our civil liberties more impinged by our fellow man or by an oppressive state? The answer to that is we'll see, especially over the course of the current administration. So, and then some of the other things that are more Minority Report-ish, that I'm referring to the movie Minority Report, our technology is already being used to point CCTV cameras and license plate readers to, well, actually the license plate readers are fixed, but the cameras often have what's called pan, tilt, zoom, the ability to be repointed. And so our system in some implementations is used to automatically repoint the cameras in the direction that the gunfire came from, so that you can see people fleeing from the scene. And I know that that has already been useful in catching various people in New York City has credited us with that. Also, per the earlier question, drones are, I think, a very interesting possibility, which is that when a gunfire is detected, it could trigger multiple drones to launch and fly to that scene and fly up the streets that could be the means of egress, and capturing the faces and the car images of all of the people and cars fleeing the scene. I mean, in general, you want to make pulling a trigger a really bad idea that people can't do a second time. So, and then another thing that actually has been tried in America, I don't know where it stands now, is an aerostat. That's something that stays in a fixed point in the sky, like a balloon or a drone, and takes high-resolution photographs of like every second of the entire city. And when a crime occurs at a given spot, one can then go back and go forward in time to see where that person went, and you can go back in time to see where that person came from. And that has been used successfully. But again, there are a lot of civil libertarians who feel that it's too much of a 1984 police state. And, we don't make that call, but when used in conjunction with this type of technology, it could be very powerful to mitigate bad things. So ultimately, the question is, what do you fear more? And whether that has changed in the past 100 days. So anyway, that's all I got. And we're a few minutes over our time. So thank you all. And thank you guys who from South Africa and from Malaysia, especially you, Bob, for getting up in the middle of the night.
Absolute pleasure.
Yes, glad to do it. Over and out.